1, 0, all engine running.
These images, which you are watching right now, went down in history as perhaps one of the most iconic moments in the history of humanity. These images also symbolize the beginning of a new era in the space adventure of mankind. The words expressed by astronaut Neil Armstrong, who first set foot on the moon, had been one of the most important steps mankind took in understanding the universe and creation. From this moment on, while the developments in science and technology were evolving towards a new channel, it also set a cornerstone for the United States in its rivalry with Russia, its biggest rival in the struggle for supremacy. NASA, which was founded in 1958, was undoubtedly the main factor that brought the United States of America, which had lagged behind Soviet Russia until 1969, when humanity took its first step on the moon, to the fore and has always kept it at the top in space and technology science until today. Let's examine together how NASA, which is a leading institution in the development of many technologies from space science to aviation, from defense to engine industry, was established, and through which stages it became the most important technology center of today's world. The Second World War, which started in 1939 and ravaged the world, would cause the death of more than 65 million people, and also ensure the establishment of a new world order. After the war, the world would be divided into two poles until 1990. One is the capitalist Western Bloc, which will be led by the USA, and the other is the Eastern Bloc, which will be led by Soviet Russia. One of the most important pillars of the rivalry between these two blocs would undoubtedly be the space race. So, when and how did the space and aviation studies of the USA, the most important representative of the Western Bloc, begin? In fact, we would not be wrong if we say that the aviation activities of the USA date back to the beginning of the 20th century. The fact that the Wright brothers made the first airplane trials in 1903 and that it was the first country to invent the airplane showed everyone that the USA should not be underestimated in the field of aviation even in those years. However, in the First World War that started in 1914, the European states, which understood the importance of aviation, paid particular attention to this field and made large investments in aircraft technologies. Realizing that despite the country where the aircraft was invented, it lagged behind in the field of aviation in the face of developments in Europe, the United States of America established the National Aviation Advisory Committee, namely NACA, which was directly affiliated to the President, on March 3, 1915. This would also go down in history as the first institution to sow the seeds of NASA. Not content with this, the United States of America opened departments in various universities in the field of aviation for the next 43 years, while also supporting the establishment of private companies. During this period, the work of NACA, one of the most important aviation institutions of the USA, was at such a high level that in the 1950s, some experimental NACA planes were even engaged in research and development studies on how to reach space at high speeds. However, there was an important problem faced by scientists here. Because the density of the atmosphere decreases after a certain height and becomes thinner. This made the thrust of the engines on the planes insufficient. The most effective way to solve this problem was to use rocket engines, which are much more powerful. Although NACA was one of the most important aviation institutions in the United States did not have a coordinated space program for space exploration. On the one hand, while NACA was working for space research, on the other hand, the Army, Air, and Navy in the U.S. Army were in competition with each other on this issue. In particular, the U.S. Air Force MISS, namely the Man in Space Soonest program, continued its efforts to launch the first human into space before the Soviets until August 1, 1958, but it was not successful. On the other hand, the Navy had implemented a program that planned to put satellites into space with the Vanguard project before Sputnik. The land forces, on the other hand, was conducting intercontinental ballistics programs with the Juno and Jupiter projects. Many universities in the country also supported these projects. As it is seen, although the United States of America has many studies in the field of space, there was no coordination as in Soviet Russia. Until the Soviets successfully launched the Sputnik 1 satellite on October 4, 1957. This situation caused a great concern and crisis in the Western world, especially in the United States of America. Because the Sputnik 1 satellite, which the Soviets placed in space, was sent into space with an intercontinental missile. This situation included a great risk in the military sense, as well as the Soviets taking a step forward in space studies. Because Russia's successful use of an intercontinental ballistic missile meant that it could send a missile to any point in the world within minutes. This was not an acceptable situation for the USA, and a solution had to be found. While all this was going on, Soviet Russia was making a show of strength by sharing the pictures of the Sputnik 1 satellite with the whole world. This showed how much of a danger the Western world was facing. Another issue that worried the United States was the dimensions of the Sputnik 1 satellite. The satellite weighed 83.6 kilograms and was shaped like a ball. Although these dimensions are defined as small for today, the fact that the satellites that the United States of America tried to send into space by spending billions of dollars at that time were around 10 kilograms, was a matter that increased the concerns. Because more weight meant more fuel and propulsion. Although the Soviets successfully launched a satellite of around 83 kilograms, the USA had not yet been able to send even a 10-kilogram satellite into space. The Soviet success of Sputnik was a turning point for space studies. Accelerating its work for space exploration from this moment on, the United States of America tried to show the world and the Soviets that it would not fall behind in this race by placing the first Explorer 1 satellite into space on January 31, 1958. But the truth is that Soviet Russia was always one step ahead. Contrary to the opposition, the developments of the Soviets in the space field did not worry the then President Dwight Eisenhower much. Eisenhower claimed that this situation would not last long and that the Soviets could not use space for war. Based on this idea, he stated that space studies should continue in the civilian field. However, there was strong opposition to this idea. Especially Lyndon Johnson, who would later become the President of the United States, was harshly critical of the President and demanded bolder steps towards ballistic missiles. As a result of the long debates in the United States Parliament and the scientific reports examined, the opposition led by Johnson and President Eisenhower met on a common point and agreed on the establishment of NASA, which would manage the civilian leg of space studies. ARPA was also decided for the institution that would carry out its military leg. President Eisenhower established NACA on July 29, 1958, by transferring it to NASA. With the appointment of Keith Glennon as its president, it started its activities on October 1, 1958. This was also a turning point for both aviation and space exploration. Because many aviation sectors, especially the aviation industry, owes their current position almost to NASA. For example, cockpits, flight cabins, jet engines, traffic control towers, landing and takeoff terminals at airports were created by NASA. In addition, he undertook very critical tasks in the development of stealth aircraft, such as the F-117 Nighthawk and F-22 Raptor, which were developed for the United States Army, which are called stealth aircraft. Let's take a look at some of the important programs developed by NASA, the leading institution in the field of space and aviation, together. First, let's talk about the Mercury project. In 1958, NASA formed an engineering group called the Space Mission Group to manage manned spaceflight programs under Robert Gilruth. The first programs of this group were conducted under the pressure of the Cold War rivalry between the USA and the Soviet Union. NASA took over the U.S. Air Force's Man in Space Soonest program, which considers many crude spacecraft designs, from rocket planes like the X-15 to small ballistic space capsules. By 1958, concepts of spaceplanes were eliminated in favor of the ballistic capsule. The project was handed over to NASA when NASA was founded that same year, and NASA renamed the project the Mercury Project. The first 7 astronauts were selected from candidates for the Navy, Air Force, and Navy test pilot programs. On May 5, 1961, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American to go into space, launched into a 15-minute ballistic, suborbital, flight in a capsule he named Freedom 7 and with a Redstone booster. A year later, Con Glenn became the first American to be launched into orbit on February 20, 1962, with the Atlas launch vehicle and the Friendship 7 ship. This also meant that the United States had crossed another threshold in space studies. Apollo Project, which will go down in history as the next and perhaps the most important project of the United States and NASA. The success of manned space exploration was welcomed by the American public. However, there was always a problem that they could not overcome. And that was that the Soviets were always one step ahead. In the eyes of the American public, it seemed certain that the Soviets would win the space race by sending the first cosmonaut to the moon. That's why President Kennedy. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy presented a bill to Congress for the federal government to send astronauts to the moon by the late 1960s. This project later became the Apollo Project. This was a very risky and big project. If the USA successfully completed this project, it would get ahead in the competition with Soviet Russia and leave its biggest rival behind in the global competition. Failure would both cause a great loss of prestige and upset all the balances in competition. In short, NASA's fate depended on this project and they had no choice but to succeed. First, in December 1968, Apollo 8 brought astronauts around the moon. The next 2 missions studied the docking maneuvers necessary for the moon landing, and eventually Apollo 11 landed on the moon in July 1969. Neil Armstrong was the first person to set foot on the moon. This was also one of the most important moments in the history of science. After this event, the USA defeated Soviet Russia in space studies and seized the advantage in global competition without giving it back. The Apollo project went down in history as the most expensive project in the USA. However, considering its prestige and gains in other areas, it was a project that deserved its value. After the success of Apollo, Skylab also carried out very important projects such as Apollo, Soyuz, SpaceSat, International Space Station, Constellation Program and Journey to Mars. However, on the surface of Mars, Curiosity, which NASA sent to Mars on November 26, 2011 and has been on duty since August 6, 2012, is the InSat sent to Mars on May 5, 2018 and has been operating since November 26, 2018. Perseverance spacecraft has been sent to Mars on July 30, 2020 and has been operating since February 18, 2021. Making the most important discoveries in the history of science, NASA not only explored space, but also created technologies that made our lives easier. We may not know whether NASA, one of the most important actors in the USA's becoming a global power, will make the first manned trip to Mars or other planets, but we can easily say that it has left a significant mark in the history of world science with its discoveries. This is the video we prepared about NASA. You can write your comments and criticisms about this video in the comments section. The arrival of better content depends on the support of our valued viewers. For the further development of our channel, it is enough to like the video and subscribe to the channel for free. See you in a new video. Stay with science.